If Lewis retired at this stage, he would be considered the most successful driver in the history of Formula One. The second half in 2018 was exceptional from Lewis, and it shut quite a few critics up. Masterclass. Also, and in terms of validation, there is nothing that gives you more validation than such a brilliant record in the ring, and that is what Lewis had. Throughout the season, Max Verstappen was arguably the better driver. In Suzuka in 2022, he was held back by Esteban Ocon in an Alpine.
Get in there, Lewis. What a way to do it, mate. What a way to win your 7th world title. Mate, you have got to be proud of that. What an awesome drive.
Thank you so much, guys. That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible. You can do it too, man. I believe in you guys. Thank you so much, everyone, for your support.
Lewis, congratulations for the 7th title. I couldn't have done it better.
Thanks so much.
Fantastic drive with the slicks. Fantastic. It's really awesome to be a witness of that, Lewis.
It was 15 November 2020, and in my view, that was the day that Lewis Hamilton's career peaked. At the 2020 Formula One Turkish Grand Prix, Lewis Hamilton sealed his record 7th world title, and he did it by winning a race for which he was not even a favorite. Throughout that weekend, Mercedes had suffered and struggled in the conditions, and the team was not expected to win this race. At that point, at that very day, Lewis Hamilton, in the eyes of many, was the best driver on the Formula One grid. There was no one who could have achieved what he did at Turkey that day. Now we are in 2024, and at this very moment, there is a question that needs to be asked. Should Lewis Hamilton have retired at the end of the 2020 Formula One season? Now let me clarify a couple of things first. When I ask this question, that whether Lewis Hamilton should have retired at the end of the 2020 Formula One season, I'm not saying that he does not deserve to be on the F1 grid. I'm not saying he's not deserving to be one of the top 5 drivers in Formula 1. That's not what I'm saying. The basic premise of this video is something similar to what happens to quite a few Formula 1 legends. They are unable to time the retirement to perfection, and in so many ways, it hurts their overall legacy. Now when we talk about Lewis, this is precisely what we are trying to figure out in this video. Now what we are trying to do in this video is trying to answer one simple question. How would Lewis have been perceived if he retired at the end of the 2020 Formula 1 season? And try to compare that with how he will be perceived now when he retires at the end of this season or in 2025 if he has not achieved further success. To answer this, we'll divide the video into 3 parts. The first part will be how Lewis was perceived at the end of the 2020 F1 season, and then we'll take a look at what happened since he hit that peak and how he's perceived right now. Finally, the third part will be the conclusion, where we'll assess what we learned in the first 2 sections. So let's begin. First of all, let's take a look at how Lewis Hamilton was perceived at the end of the 2020 F1 season. Now the first point is that Lewis was considered the best driver on the grid. From 2014 till 2020, even as a metric, even though I won't say it is the most reliable one, Lewis Hamilton was voted the best driver on the F1 grid from 2014 till 2020 by all team principals. Yes, every year they used to do these ratings, and Lewis Hamilton came out on top every time. Not once, not twice, not most of the time. He came out on top every time. And when you have that kind of an accolade, maybe once or twice it works your way, but when it is working your way every single season, it means you are considered the benchmark on the grid. And it was quite true at the time, because Fernando Alonso, one of his key challengers, he was not on the F1 grid anymore. Sebastian Vettel as well, the stint at Ferrari had wore him down completely, and he was not performing to the level that you saw vintage Sebastian perform. Then you talk about the next generation, you had Max Verstappen, who was being very consistent and chopping at the heels, but he never had the true competitive machinery to compete against Lewis on a regular basis. You also had Charles Leclerc, who was rising through the ranks, and then Lando Norris as well, who was still quite young at the time. So then if you look at that grid, Lewis Hamilton stood out and was considered the benchmark in F1. Next up is achievements. Lewis Hamilton had broken almost every record that Michael Schumacher had set at the time. Some of the Michael Schumacher records that had stood out when he retired was he had the most wins, he had the most pole positions, most points, and so on. Lewis Hamilton had broken all of them, and he was also level at 7 world championships. If Lewis retired at this stage, he would be considered the most successful driver in the history of Formula 1. Next up, the debate around, well, it's just the car, had started to die down as well. Because by this time, Lewis had had 2 title battles against Sebastian Vettel. Now, of course, Ferrari, it's basically a self-cannibalizing organization, so it is tough to have title battles when you're driving for Ferrari. But still, the second half in 2018 was exceptional from Lewis, and it shut quite a few critics up. Also, he had a few battles against Nico Rosberg as well in 2014 and to an extent in 2015 as well. And the debate around the entire result coming because just he had the car, it was starting to die down at this stage. Next up, and something that is arguably considered even today, the hallmark of an elite F1 driver is the record in the wet races. Lewis Hamilton from 2014 to 2020 was just sublime. During that time, there were 14 wet races, and Lewis Hamilton only lost 2 of them. And the first race that he lost was in 2014, where he started the race at the back of the grid when Daniel Ricciardo ended up winning in Hungary. Then the other race that he lost was in 2019 when Max Verstappen had a brilliant race. Other than those 2, from 2014 till 2020, Lewis Hamilton was the rain master. Every time there was rain, you are expecting a Lewis Hamilton masterclass. And in terms of validation, there is nothing that gives you more validation than such a brilliant record in the rain. And that is what Lewis had at this point in time. And finally, a lot of his shortcomings were starting to get papered over. How? Well, by the 2013 F1 season, Lewis Hamilton was considered one of the elite drivers in Formula 1. It was him, Sebastian Vettel, and Fernando Alonso. But would you call him the best driver in Formula 1 in 2013? You probably won't. You'd still put Vettel and Alonso above him. And the reason behind that was, it was primarily just a couple of things where, in terms of consistency and making unnecessary mistakes, Lewis tended to do that a bit more as compared to Alonso and Vettel, who were just relentless. That is something that stood out for those 2 compared to Lewis. On his day, Lewis can beat them, but overall in a season, you might end up favoring an Alonso or a Vettel in a title battle. Now, by 2020, such perceptions, they had died down. And such criticisms, they were a thing of the past, because for the last 7 years, Lewis, even if he had these off weekends, they used to get papered over because the car was just exceptional. And in terms of rivalries and battles, he didn't have that kind of competition. By the end of 2020, Lewis Hamilton was the most successful driver in Formula 1, the one that was considered the benchmark on the F1 grid, the best driver in the rain, and in terms of weaknesses, there are very few that would have been pointed out at that very moment. If he had retired in 2020, the case of him being considered the greatest of all time, not in my eyes, but in the eyes of many fans and even F1 pundits, it would have been much, much bigger. Now, let's take a look at how things kind of changed from the 2021 F1 season to where we find ourselves today. Now, when we take a look at what happened post 2020 and from the 2021 F1 season onwards, let's just say things started to go wrong. The first of them was, well, Lewis Hamilton had his very first title battle against a team that was not going to self-cannibalize itself throughout a season and have an elite driver behind the wheel. Yes, we are talking about the Max Verstappen Red Bull combo that did not have the kind of weaknesses that the Sebastian Vettel Ferrari combo had. In all fairness, this started to change the perception around Lewis, because even though again we can debate all day at the kind of impact the Michael Massey decision had in the last race, however, it does not change the fact that throughout the season, Max Verstappen was arguably the better driver. He made the lesser mistakes, he was far more consistent, and to be honest, if it was not for the kind of bad luck that he had in Baku, or to an extent what happened in Hungary or Silverstone, Max Verstappen would have sealed the championship with a few races to spare. And that's where the entire issue comes up, because in that season, the first time Lewis was up against an equal in terms of team performance and the driver, it was Lewis who came up second best. And something like that does break the aura that Lewis had at the end of the 2020 season. Next up is the fact that Lewis, since 2020, he has not been considered the best driver in F1 anymore. In 2021, that honor went to Max Verstappen, and since then he has held on to it. And during this time, sure, Lewis Hamilton, arguably he's been one of the top 5 drivers in F1 throughout this tenure, but has he been the best driver that he was until 2020? No, he's not. He's not been that. And that is something that does play a role in tempering the kind of perception anyone would have of him. Next up, something that worked like a validation for Lewis was his wet weather accolades. You look at Lewis Hamilton's record in the wet weather from 2021 to right now, it's just not good. You look at races like Imola in 2021, Lewis Hamilton lost out to Max Verstappen in a straight fight. Then again, he bounced back in Sochi, where he won the race, but again it came down to having the right tire choice against Lando Norris, and he got that done. And it was a brilliant call. But then you look at the rest of the races and you see the fact that Lewis was making far too many mistakes in these wet weather races, and the results were just not there. In Hungary in 2021, he was the only driver that did not pit for the slicks. In Imola 2022, he was lapped by Max Verstappen while George Russell was fighting for P4. In Suzuka in 2022, he was held back by Esteban Ocon in an Alpine. That's not the kind of races you expect from a driver who at one time, not long ago, was considered the best on the grid. In so many ways, something that was the biggest validation for Lewis Hamilton's run when Mercedes were dominant, it is proving to his biggest critique when the car is not as dominant as it used to be. Next up, and arguably something that has become a bit more visible and more prevalent, is the fact that the weaknesses and shortcomings that tended to be papered over during the dominant Mercedes era, they're back now. Even during the dominant Mercedes era, Lewis Hamilton used to make small mistakes here and there, but they did not cost him as much. From 2021 onwards, they have been costing him a lot. It cost him a lot during the title battle with Max Verstappen in 2021. In 2022 and 2023, there have been quite a few off weekends from Lewis where the kind of level that he should have ideally been performing at, it's just not there. In 2022, in fact, he was even outscored by George Russell, and somewhere down the line, these things don't shine a bright light on Lewis Hamilton and even his driving accolades. Something else when it comes to shortcomings that gets highlighted is Lewis Hamilton's record in the wet weather before Mercedes became dominant. Before Mercedes dominance, Lewis Hamilton from 2007 till 2013 was part of 20 wet races. Now, out of these 20 wet races, Lewis Hamilton won 4 of them. Out of these 4 races, 3 of them were won in 2007 and 2008, when Mercedes and Ferrari were the 2 dominant cars at the time. Now, when you see these numbers, they don't paint a pretty picture, and that is something that gets highlighted when the car is just not there. And yes, that is something that gets counted against you. Finally, arguably the most damning thing in my view is the fact that it's the car debate, something that I'm not a huge fan of. That debate is back, and the reason behind it is this massive divergence in Lewis Hamilton's record when the car was miles ahead of the entire competition in those 7 years from 2014 till 2020, and you compare it with the rest of his career, and the divergence in results and the divergence in the kind of success that he had in those 7 years and at the rest of it, the gap is huge. And that is why once again these questions get raised. The first question is his wet weather record before the Mercedes dominant era and post the Mercedes dominant era. It gets highlighted a lot. Then you take a look at the results in terms of the kind of mistakes that he made during the dominance and pre and post that time. You take all that into consideration, and whatever weaknesses were there, they tend to get highlighted a lot more when your car is not the best on the grid. And that is precisely what Lewis is suffering from right now. Now, once we looked at how Lewis was perceived at the end of the 2020 F1 season and how he's perceived now, we can see that there is a massive drop off of how the perception has changed since then. Now, the question at this point in time is whether Lewis Hamilton should have retired at the end of the 2020 F1 season. To be honest, the question is not that Lewis Hamilton should have retired at the end of the 2020 F1 season. The question is simple: would Lewis Hamilton have been perceived in a much better and grander way if he had retired at the end of the 2020 F1 season? Well, if we have to draw comparisons, at the end of the 2020 F1 season, Lewis Hamilton was perceived as someone who was the best in F1, who was arguably the Rainmeister because, well, he won 12 of the 14 races, who was considered someone whose result was not dependent on the car at that point in time, as the it's the car debate was over, and someone who was really treated as a benchmark in F1. Since then, if we take a look at things as they are right now, he's not considered the best in F1 anymore. A lot of his results have been proved to be a product of the car that he had under him. His wet weather record has been quite abysmal, and finally, the first time he had a championship battle in which the parameters were almost similar. In terms of driving abilities, he came out second best. When you take all these things into consideration, I think the answer is quite clear. Unless Lewis ends up winning a title before he ends his career and has 8 world titles, it's hard to see him being perceived better now than how he would have been perceived at the end of 2020. So yes, if we have to answer the question, unless Lewis Hamilton wins his 8th world title, he should have ideally retired at the end of the 2020 F1 season, and his legacy and his perception would have been much bigger, much grander than how it is right now. Now let me reiterate one thing. I'm not saying that he does not deserve to be in F1. That is not the question and that is not the debate. He's clearly one of the top 5 drivers in F1 even right now. But would his legacy and perception been better if he retired at the end of 2020? Well, if he does not win another title, yes, it would have been better. So these are my views. What do you guys think? Do let me know in the comment section. Please like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.